So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Technology Strategies Through a Crisis webinar. My name is Mike Mason. I'm Global Head of Technology for Thoughtworks, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. In our last webinar, we heard Nigel Dalton and Gary O'Brien discuss the next normal. And in this webinar, we want to focus more on the technical aspects and the technology strategy that businesses need to adopt in order to navigate out of the COVID-19 crisis.
I'd like to open with an acknowledgement of country. For our friends joining us from outside of Australia, an acknowledgement of country is an opportunity to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and the ongoing custodians of the land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia, wherever you are. And in Brisbane, where I am, that's the Turrbal and the Yagara people. And we recognise the continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. And on behalf of the panel, I'd like to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so this is a Zoom webinar. Everybody's probably familiar with Zoom, spending 10 hours a day on it, as we all do now. But this is webinar mode, so there's a Q&A at the bottom of the screen. It helps us if you use the Q&A for questions. And keep the chat for sort of chat stuff, because with the Q&A, we have a little bit more management function. We can see which questions have been answered, all that kind of thing. For our audience in China, we apologize. We were going to have a live interpreter today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get that to work. But what we will suggest is if you want to submit questions in Mandarin in the chat, we will have a translator to be able to give us those questions, and we'll try to address those as well. We are going to be recording this session to make it available to anyone who registered but couldn't attend. And our audience in China are going to be getting a recording with translated captions. Hope everybody's cool with that. If you have technical issues, please try posting in the chat channel. Sometimes you can disconnect and reconnect, and if you have an audio problem or something like that. We're not going to be doing slides today. We'd rather you could see us, and we can, well, we can't see you, but we can imagine you out there. It's one of the most difficult things actually about being a virtual presenter these days, is the lack of audience connection. It's quite tricky for us.
That helps.
I do. I have my Thoughtworks friends, and we can all hang out and chat with each other. Speaking of which, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. So Sarah Taraporewalla is a principal technologist based in our Brisbane office in Australia. I'm going to read the blurb. Here we go. Where she specializes in developing robust software for the future delivered today. She's passionate about helping CTOs and architects transform their business, strategy, and product to meet the digital demands of their customers. Although primarily focused on software design, she also has a lot to say about how software should be developed to accommodate the changing pace of business and how people should be treated within teams. Welcome, Sarah. And of course, our chief scientist, Martin Fowler, has 2 decades of experience helping corporations evolve and utilize technology for mission-critical information systems, is a renowned author, an original signatory on the Agile Software Manifesto. He has 7 award-winning books on software development. Martin's 7, not 7?
7 books, but not all award-winning.
Oh, I'm sure many of them are.
7 books, some of which are award-winning, would be a better phrase. That's whoever's written this.
Okay.
And it's some phrase about me being passionate about things, and then I really lose it when I'm accused of being passionate about something. I'm British. I'm not supposed to be passionate about things.
I think all of us presenters find it difficult writing about ourselves in the third person, those kinds of verbs. So anyway, Martin and Sarah, welcome. Welcome to today's presentation. So in the last webinar, so we had Nigel and Gary, and they were talking about the new normal. And I think they were talking about it kind of from a business perspective, how businesses are going to need to alter their strategies and respond to what's happening right now in order to try to navigate out of the crisis. And Gary O'Brien actually co-authored with me and Guo Zhao, who's the CEO of Thoughtworks, last year a book called Digital Transformation Game Plan. And in that book, we had a particular approach to how we felt digital transformations should be achieved, with a thin slice through the business, really creating value end to end, not doing just individual things, but really focusing on customer value. But what's interesting is that book came out in very late 2019, and here we are mid 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. And what's interesting is the need for digital transformation is still here, but it's in a very different form and style to what we were writing about at the end of last year. And additionally, we have to acknowledge the effectively constitutional crisis that's happening in the US right now, which I'm sure is actually distracting a lot of people, and making it harder to work, in addition to this kind of the whole working from home thing.
Yeah, it says something that actually COVID has not been the #1 worry of people I've been in contact with over the last few days. It's just gone off the radar as if, oh yeah, there's a major pandemic going on. That's just background noise compared to what's been happening these last few days. And I must admit, my ability to work the last few days has been completely hosed. And it's hit many people. And then this is, one of the things to remember is these crises really do hit people, and they hit people even harder when you're remote like this. I've been on 2 calls with all of my colleagues in North America that were just open calls where people could talk about how they were feeling about the crisis and the situation. And it's been really hard. And of course, usually, at least for most of my colleagues, we're at a client site or in the office. We're able to have that contact and talk through what's going on. This time, we're all stuck at home, and we can only do this talking through on Zoom. And it makes dealing with the extra crisis an extra level of challenge to try and figure out how to cope with it. And it certainly for us in North America, it's not a small crisis. And I know similar things have happened in Australia, and racism in general is a problem across the world. It's a worldwide virus that's infected humans since the dawn of humanity. We're now on a crisis layered on top of a crisis in America. And as we're recording this, a new thing has cropped up that could have significant consequences. And it's all up in the air, and we don't know, and I'm trying not to look at my Twitter stream.
I think it is it's very important to acknowledge that. Like, we've talked about working from home, and I'm not sure how close anyone is to working from home at the moment. We're all sort of emergency working from home in a crisis, rather than as a planned sort of effective response to a deliberate change. I thought I was on a webinar a couple of weeks ago where it was about the future of work, and the central thesis of the presenter was not necessarily that there's a particular new normal that we've hit, but it's actually an acceleration. Like the pandemic and the lockdowns have accelerated people's acceptance and understanding of working from home. I asked a question about retail, right? Because every time there's any kind of a crisis, a bunch of retailers fold. It certainly seems to be a difficult business to be in, and certainly if you can't have people in your store, you're not going to be able to sell anything. And so I asked a similar question there. Is this a new normal when it comes to retail, or is it an acceleration of things that we were already seeing? And the response I got back was, it's very much an acceleration, because if there were weaker players in the market, that weakness has either driven them out of business or is about to be capitalized on by their competitors in terms of buying them up, mergers and acquisitions, all that kind of thing. When we talked about this previously and talking about getting to the new normal, we had this 3-phased approach to the way businesses should handle it. So phase one was reinforcing business fundamentals, looking at cash flow, receivables, health of the business, safety of your staff. That's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about the ability to work from home. You know, and from a technology perspective, that's things like having VPNs and access to systems and all that kind of thing. But then phase two was we talk about redirecting, so fast tracking digital initiatives, adapting ways of working, identifying new signals of change, and changing customer needs. Did you want to jump in, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that I find it so amazing that we've been able to jump work from home for long periods of time. And I was kind of thinking about 10 years ago when I was in London and we would have snow days. And that's it. We can't get to the office. Everyone, you've got a day off.
Right.
But there's so many tools and technologies that are in existence right now that have allowed us to almost seamlessly work from home. And I know a couple of businesses struggled a little bit with VPNs, but I think from the majority of clients that we're talking to, we're, you know, as productive as when we were in the office. And there's a lot of talk about, is this the new normal? You know, is this the next step? Have we just, as you said, accelerated that acceptance for working from home? And do we need to start thinking about what returning, you know, does a return to the office still look the same? Or are we going to continue with these patterns that we've got, that we've set up? And then I think there are a couple of things that we're hobbling by on. You know, I think people have been very effective in coding from home, but things like that collaboration, that ability to talk and respond quickly, like you were saying, Martin, it's a lot easier to have some of these conversations when you're in the office and you can talk a bit more personally to people. So I think we're going to need to find different ways of working through this rather than just accept that we're going to go back to the way that we were working.
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I was in an interesting kind of a role at Thoughtworks, part of the global technology team. And so about half the time I'd actually be on the road visiting clients and other teams. And the other half of the time I was at home. So I was sort of used to working from home. But I was always energized when I got to actually go spend face time with my colleagues, you know, and I certainly have been missing that, even though, you know, I've still got all the monitors and TVs and webcams and all the bits and bobs that I could possibly need.
Yeah, I don't think Zoom doesn't quite replace those coffee chats, those quiet conversations that you have before you get into a meeting. I find that to be a lot trickier to navigate. You know, especially thinking about as a leader, how do I transfer my my skills, my leadership skills, to where I've only just got this Zoom call and it has to be very scheduled.
Yeah, and you almost, if you are looking to do some of the, I don't know what you call it, it's not quite team building, but it's maintaining personal relationships. You actually need to find ways to almost schedule that and be deliberate about it happening, because it's not happening, you know, on the way to get a coffee or after work.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're going to need to figure out going forward, because I don't see. I think the trend is to continue in some way to allow people from work to home, if nothing else, because the war on talent that we talk about, it's going to worsen. As I've already seen it in Brisbane, where a couple of people have been given the choice of Brisbane jobs versus they could do the same remote work and get a Silicon Valley job. So that, suddenly our ability to work remotely has opened the doors to a larger market, which will...
I think sorry, Sarah.
No, go on.
I think the dynamics of the talent market it's going to be really interesting to see how that stuff plays out, because you're totally right. Like, in theory, you could hire anyone anywhere around the world. But one of the things that we talked about when we did the radar a few weeks ago, so we did a radar, a Thoughtworks technology radar, something we do twice a year. Usually we get together in person to do it because it's a fairly intense discussion about the state of technologies and what our recommendation is on them. But one of the things was we had to do that remotely. The question is, we discussed remote pair programming, and where on that, what should we say about remote pairing? And it was interesting because the tools have improved radically around collaborating on technology. And I think we see the most recent thing I saw was, I think it was from Microsoft or another cloud platform, where there are entirely virtual development environments somewhere in the cloud that two people can just connect to and spin up and then work and pair on them. But one of the things that we did discuss was that a lot of people kind of make some poor assumptions about just because you're connected, you can collaborate effectively. And, time zones are still a thing, right? Yeah. So people in Australia are getting a Silicon Valley job. Well, that's nice, but time zones are still a thing. Software is a very social activity. Like I'm not sure I have a particular prediction, but I'm really interested to see how this pans out and changes the way we build systems.
Yeah, so Evan Botcher has been talking a little bit about the pairing, and there's that difference between, so what we usually do is collaborate at the office. So that's pairing synchronously in the same place. There's the other extreme, which is we're async. So there's a lot of tools set up, pull requests. You could move to a lot pull requests where you're working asynchronously and then you're touching base every so often. Whereas where we're seeing teams settling on is that synchronous, remote synchronous. So they're still in the same time. They're still working towards the same outcome. They might be talking about the discussion and then turn Zoom off and then get some code out and then come back, in 2 Pomodoros, come back and check in and then talk about what they've done, commit that code and then move on to the next little bit. So we're seeing changes in the ways that we're working to still drive the same outcomes of what we like when we were in the office working together.
Yeah, so Martin, I want to ask you a question. I mean, during your career, you've before you came to Thoughtworks and while you were at Thoughtworks, you've consulted for a lot of organizations and tried to help them, organize their teams to build software. And there's a lot of relationship building that you need to do as a consultant, but there's also a lot of relationship building that teams need to do in order to be able to produce anything. Do you have any thoughts on how the forced remoteness is going to make that more difficult? Do you think that the kinds of systems we'll build will change because of that, or this is something we can work through video?
Well, certainly the forced remoteness, I think, makes a big difference because it's not the same. I mean, I've always worked largely remotely. So when I'm not traveling to give talks or whatever, I'm working from home. And it's not been the same the last few months, even before the last few days crisis. Just the single crisis was enough to kind of significantly hit you. And I'm not someone, say, with young kids. And if you've got young kids, your kids are at home, right? So this is not normal working from home. So, I mean, that's a factor there. I mean, another thing that strikes me, it's interesting. Throughout my whole career, we've seen, we're going to be all remote very soon. And it sounds odd, but yes, we were saying things like that in the 80s, right? I mean, there was this sense of, we're going to get this, the internet appeared in the 90s, and we thought, we can do the World Wide Web and that kind of stuff. And of course, open source development has pushed a lot with very remote working throughout a lot of this kind of period. I mean, one thing that's important, a while ago, I wrote an article about remote working where a point that I felt was very important to make was there are different kinds of remote working. And in particular, I wanted to separate sort of 3 different models. One's where you have a team split in multiple locations. One where you have most people together on site and then a few people in satellite as being on their own as satellites. And then the third model where everybody was remote. And we're kind of in the third mode at the moment where everybody's at home and everyone's remote. And that is, it's important to realize they're different because the trade-offs are different between the 3. I mean, we do a lot of multi-site work at Thoughtworks where we've got multiple teams in different places. And that yields a different set of problems as to when you're all remote together. So you have to think about what you're going to do in tune with how that model way of working. Now, one of the things that we did very much with the early agile stuff, and particularly with extreme programming, is we pushed back against the idea of having multiple site teams and said, no, you really want people together in the same space where they can communicate more easily and more fluently. And I do still believe that if you've got a particular group of people and you want them to work in their most effective manner, having them all in the same physical space is for most teams going to be the way to do it, because you do have a much richer collaboration space that way. I say most because I think there are some people who are probably better operating remotely. And I never think something is right for everybody, right? Never say always, something like that. Of course, the big advantage you have with more flexibility for remoteness is that you can assemble a team that you can't put all in the same place. And that enables a lot of folks. I mean, it enables people who, maybe it's just the point in their lives that they need to be home more often. And as a result, if they can work from home more frequently, that makes a big difference. Makes a very big difference for women, for instance, who are often still stuck with a lot of the childcare issues. I know Sarah's written some very good stuff about that kind of thing from your experience. It also allows you to reach people who just don't want to live in the typical big tech cities. Not everybody wants to move to San Francisco. So a great strength of the remoteness is the fact you've got access to people who otherwise you wouldn't be able to get hold of. But it's a trade-off. I mean, all of these different patterns are working. There's no perfect solution. You trade them off with each other. And I think we will see more acceptance of remote working in the future, but also I think there may well be many people who say, oh my God, that whole COVID stuff was so awful. I never want to go back to remote working again.
It's been interesting to look at where it does work and where it doesn't work, because one of the things about remote work is that you need good ways to understand that your team is still being effective, or to help your team being effective. I think leadership of remote teams is something that a lot of folks were not ready for, whether that's, project managers, through to kind of C-levels of companies were just not ready for that. Something that I would say is probably is important is a good amount of trust amongst team members, because without trust you end up with micromanagement, which in a remote scenario is even worse than like micromanagement where a manager has to actually at least walk up to your desk in order to micromanage you, whereas now you're getting micromanaged by instant messenger all day long. I imagine that's a lot worse.
Yeah, I can just imagine that scene from Office Space where you get 3 people come check off on them. It's just 10 times worse.
I mean, how do you see the leadership thing changing? As a technology leader, or like, let's talk about an engineering lead or a tech lead or something like that. Like, how is that changing, given the remote nature of everything
now? I think that we've got to make things more visible in an async world. Because you can't come up to someone and just tap them on the shoulder and see what they're doing. So there's got to be a lot of transparency and visibility and trust. So trust that everyone knows what they're working to. So have that goal set quite clearly with everyone. I think it's helped that existing teams have now gone to remote, as opposed to making teams, like forming that team and then trying to take that. I think that'll be a challenge that we're going to see coming down the line. Whereas at the moment, we've got a lot of trust already within our teams, so that we need to build on that and find ways to make things a little bit more visible, rely on a little bit more async communication, and as you said, trust. That when you set a goal or an outcome that we're trying to deliver, and then you trust the team members to actually deliver that.
Do you think it will make a difference in the technology choices that we make? Like, are there either tech choices, like, when it comes to platforms and moving pieces, nuts and bolts, or kind of ways of arranging things, architecture, building stuff? Are there changes to that you can see because of the remote nature of what we're doing now?
Well, certainly a lot of this kind of stuff has been enabled hugely by the shift to cloud. Right? Once you begin to think of the data center as this amorphous thing out there, and you can leverage it much more, that makes, I think, a big difference. And I think it'll be interesting to see as we go more to the idea of people doing full development stuff on that's purely a cloud experience. There's no code sitting on your local machine. It's all out there on cloud servers. I mean, that is the timing of that has worked out very well in many ways, because that's kind of hit just at this point where we kind of need it.
Yeah, and then we've got to think about those security models that we have with it. We can no longer just trust that if you've got access within my own physical network, then you're safe. Think about zero trust architectures, or the perimeterless corporation, so that beyond corp model, and think about trust nobody, and then build up that security model around that.
We got a question in the chat here, and I do encourage the audience to throw questions in the Q&A. Use that rather than the chat; it's easier for us to manage. But related to what we were talking about, Katie says, "How do you see the impact of the loss of transparency due to not having walls or visual systems exposing the work to other teams or passers-by in the office?"
It's an interesting one, because I remember so many organizations, there's not very much transparency even in the office, right? Because we're relatively unusual at Thoughtworks, because you can always spot the Thoughtworks space because of card walls and all the kind of visual stuff we like on the walls. And that's a sign of that transparency. And I think you can achieve that quite well with a number of the digital techniques that we use. Help encourage that kind of transparency. Although I think it's more of a people thing than it is a tools and technology thing. You just have to have that, you have to get that notion of saying we have to work in a transparent manner and be transparent.
What's that? People over tools and technologies, Martin?
Oh yeah, that's a really good idea. Somebody should write that down.
And there's another question while we're still talking about the work from home thing. Jun Hong says, will working from home change the way that people interact with business applications in an organization? What's the outlook for enterprise applications?
Yeah, I think that places that have already shifted to cloud-based enterprise applications, like the Office 365 or the Google Suite, or the SaaS-based products, they were able to work from home quite easily because they didn't have to rely on those the VPNs or the data center, the stuff that exists within the Office servers. So I think the move, I can see that the move to those cloud offerings of those business systems, I see lots of companies at the moment that haven't, it might have been lower down on the priority of things to do within the next couple of years. It's just jumped to it was one of the first things that they did in order to keep the lights on, jump to those cloud offerings.
I think it's funny for me as someone who's written a book on digital transformation. Part of the problem with the phrase digital transformation is everybody thinks it means something different. Satya Nadella has been talking about digital transformation meaning adoption of Microsoft Teams, right? Whereas I would call that, I don't think that's digital transformation. I think it's like digital enablement of staff or something like that, right? But it is interesting that everybody's accelerating their technology choices. Cloud's a good one. I think I was discussing with Keith Morris in the UK, and Keith wrote a book, and there's a new book, updated version coming out this year, Infrastructure as Code. So he's one of the guys who's been talking about how we need to apply a high amount of automation to all of our stuff, all of our cloud systems, AWS templates, all that kind of stuff. But what he said was the pandemic has really exposed the cracks in people's IT systems, even if they thought they had a cloud-based system and they had scalability, and they had all the things that they were supposed to have. When the crisis actually hit and it drove consumers online, they still ran into scaling problems, because although they were on cloud, that's not enough. That's just a hosting location. You still need to have characteristics that enable you to handle that shift, that scaling.
Yeah, I find it interesting the way that that certain businesses have responded to that, especially a couple of the retail businesses which were hit quite hard, where as people locked down, they decided to shop for homewares a little bit more, or buy board games because that's what the Prime Minister's wife was doing. So there was sort of this interesting uptick in retail as people started to work from home, and that the consequences of that I found quite interesting, because even if they could scale the website, even if they were on the cloud and they could scale that website and put the money behind many servers, there was not that whole, there was a holistic problem, a system problem, because you can drive so many people through your website's front door, but there's still the same warehouse, there's still the same delivery centers, and without that, a similar scale out of that, the IT department working in isolation is not going to help the actual customer experience. And I think, I was going to say that something that Gary was talking about was it's more than just an IT department working in isolation, and that is you can see that in the effects of having a website that can scale, so that customers can come in the front door and we don't need queuing systems to let them onto our website. We've got them in there, they're purchasing, and all of a sudden the stock, the stock has run out, or we can't get things out of the warehouse fast enough. We have to shut down Woolworths and Coles had to shut down a couple of shops just in order to fulfill these orders. And that's where tech organizations working just, seat at the board on the same collaboration with the rest of the business, the rest of the company, that's where we need to shift to.
It's interesting. A lot of people are talking about resilience now. Resilience is the new watchword. And it's interesting, you draw a distinction between a lot of organizations have a problem with IT resilience or scalability, and a lot of IT departments get a bad reputation for not doing a great job with systems or being slow to have a turnaround for changes. I know a lot of businesses are, forever disappointed at the pace of change from their IT systems. But in a way, what you're saying is it's actually holistic business adaptability, not just adaptability of the IT department that is important.
Yeah, exactly.
I got to talk about cloud. Got to talk about cloud some more. Lift and shift. We're now hearing that as it's just funny to me because people are accelerating their projects. I think everybody who was paying attention realized that they should probably start getting onto the cloud, and most organizations had at least some of their stuff there, but a lot of things still in traditional data centers, and a lot of folks have taken this as a kick in the pants to accelerate that stuff, and are now doing cloud lift and shift as kind of a overt part of their strategy. It's funny to me though, because lift and shift has always been sort of something that I would have said as a slightly derogatory term, right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit more, and how we see the nuance in cloud lift and shift? Martin, you nodded strongly there. What do you?
Well, I mean, this is the point, I think, is that if you do a lift and shift, all you are doing is swapping one hosting provider for another, probably more expensive hosting provider, because the economics of cloud don't work terribly well with lift and shifted systems. It's probably going to be in some ways more difficult to manage because you've got a whole different environment that you're not familiar with, and you're not really getting any of the advantages of being on the cloud by doing a lift and shift strategy, because you're just taking a system that was designed for working on your own iron and shifting it into the cloud. So what you need is a different approach that actually says, well, let's design it as if it's supposed to be running in the cloud. But that requires, a significant rethinking of how you want to operate there. But that's where the real benefits go, because then you're able to take advantage of cloud services. You're able to take advantage of the built-in scalability things that the cloud gives you. You're able to simplify your management processes. That's where the real gain appears. And so that's why what we tend to do is to encourage people to go to that. No, don't just lift and shift. Rethink how you want this thing to run in the cloud and build it in a cloud, at least a cloud aware manner, even if it's not a fully cloud native manner, but at least that it's aware that you're operating in a cloud environment. And that's about as much as I know, because I don't do real work. It's people like Sarah that do real work.
Question in the chat here, Sarah. What if cloud's hit by a serious problem? It's happened before. Amazon regions have gone down.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's where we start thinking about, what does multi-cloud, what does multi-cloud mean for us? And you've got the resilience strategies, which is multi-region, make sure that it's hosted in many places. And then you've got to thinking of, well, what about vendor lock-in? So if I have got my code set up that is purely on one of the clouding providers, and I suddenly don't like their offering, I can get a better price somewhere else. And this is the thing that I worry about more so with vendor lock-in. What if you stop agreeing with the business or the ethics of one of these cloud providers, and you've tied your technology and your system so tightly to that particular provider, it's almost like handing over part of your business to them, because they're always going to, if you have to rely on them, then you lose some of that negotiating power. You know, back in the day before cloud, we talked about vendor lock-in as a thing that we don't want to do. We don't want to tie ourselves to one particular technology provider, because it doesn't give us options. It closes a couple of the options. So what does multi-cloud, you know, how can we think about multi-cloud? What does that mean for our from our technology choices that we're making? Scott Shaw was talking about multi-cloud, I think, on the podcast recently with Jamak, where he was talking about that notion of being able to take what you're writing that's for the cloud, but putting it in different cloud providers, and how much of your business are you going to allow for that, trading off with the speed that it would take, or that would drag on the developing your systems in that way.
Because I mean, that's the trade-off, right? Like, so if you are using a particular cloud platform, I'm not going to mention any of them because I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for a particular one, but whichever one you had picked, the promise of a platform is that if you use the platform features, that gives you some acceleration. And presumably the problem with designing something that is more easily portable between clouds is you're taking less advantage of those specific platform features. So you're going to need to, you know, implement some of those things yourself, or you know, you're going to move slower. Like, where are we at with workloads that are in theory portable between clouds?
I think Kubernetes is actually helping to address a lot of that. So we've got a lot of projects using Kubernetes. We're using it on our local machines. We're using it in production, which basically by using that, we've abstracted the metal a little bit further away from our implementation of it. I think it's a little bit harder to use some of those baked-in features that the cloud providers offer. But the Kubernetes ecosystem itself is actually getting really, really impressive. And so you can do things like automatic scaling and having it's the Kubernetes plane, which is helping abstract away from your cloud providers.
Cool. And just one last, we got questions coming up in the Q&A. So folks, please do throw questions in. We'll try and get to them. There's a question here about cybersecurity. So, you know, in the context of cloud, do you think organizations are prepared for digital invasion at a massive scale, you know, cyber attacks? Have you seen any good examples for zero trust architecture adoption?
Well, it's not directly answering the question, but I will point people to a recent article that was published on my website, martinfowler.com, by our colleague Jim Gumbley in the UK. He's one of our security leads in the UK. He's worked with government stuff. And it's not a specific architecture, but an approach to threat modeling, which is a kind of many people see as this kind of high ceremony technique for security, but Jim's approach is to do it in small pieces regularly and get everybody in the team engaged in threat modeling exercises, so that everybody's kind of thinking about how and getting into that mindset of thinking about threats. And that's a human and a process approach, but it certainly is one that strikes me as a very effective technique, and certainly from what our experience is, though you can never be sure when it comes to testing on security fronts, it's certainly a way to get people thinking more firmly in that security direction. And so I'd certainly encourage people to take a look at that kind of technique. You really want everybody thinking about security. One thing you definitely want to avoid is what we jokingly call the security sandwich approach, where you do some thinking about security up front and then do some penetration testing at the end and kind of hope that that kind of deals with it. No, you've got to have everybody aware and thinking and trying to get into that mindset. And the kind of threat modeling approach that Jim uses is, I think, a great example of how you can tackle that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people seem to think that security is a bit of a black and white thing, whereas it's not. It's more of a sliding scale. And the best security folks that I've worked with were actually kind of a little bit like lawyers. They wouldn't tell you exactly what to do. They would tell you the risks and the consequences if you didn't or did do something. So it was less of a prescriptive security approach and more of an advisory one. And I think that the same is true for cloud. Like the whole premise that cloud is somehow less secure because it's cloud, to me doesn't hold any water, because you've still got a major cloud vendor who is attempting to help all of their clients build secure systems and secure that cloud from attack. So you've got the entire weight of that cloud vendor behind you, rather than just an individual organization's security team. Michael asks, what's the business case for multi-cloud? When does the cost of resilience or redundancy outweigh its benefit? I'm just going to take a stab at answering that question and say it depends. And you really do need to build a model to figure out, is it worth, how much stuff do you need to build, or how much slower do you need to go in order to have a truly portable workload between clouds, versus the chance that you think you would actually need to move something, and then your estimated cost of moving from one major cloud platform to another, assuming you had sort of used all the features. And there's probably even architectural techniques that you can use to use a cloud's feature, but be clear about when you're using it, and then use some sort of an interface to allow you to maybe switch away a little bit more easily. So we are coming closer to the end. I do want to ask a question here from Li Chu, who says, and this is a kind of a ThoughtWorks question: how did the pandemic change the way you engage with clients and deliver projects for them?
So far, not a huge amount that I'm seeing. We're obviously not on site. One of the things that we really love is to be on site, to collaborate and to talk to everyone. But we haven't seen like productivity problems within teams. Teams are kind of just motoring on and getting going. We've had to adapt some of our processes, a bit like the pairing, thinking about what remote synchronous pairing might look like. The biggest impacts have been on things like running workshops. So how do we do inception workshops? How do we do discoveries? How do we do retros? I think retros have been one of the ones that we have always said we would struggle to have remote retros. Every time we thought about bringing someone in who was working in a different office into the retro, we always were asked questions how that would happen. But everyone being on the computer and using some tools has actually helped a lot with those. I think we've been publishing a couple of the changes that we've been making to our ways of working in a remote playbook, haven't we? Yeah. Changes to inceptions, and we've had a slight head start on this because our China colleagues started it in January. So in Australia, we got to leverage a lot of the lessons that we learned from them.
And of course, we did the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar. The latest edition of that was entirely remote. Martin and I were part of the team that did that. It was so it's a global meeting, and that was one of the biggest problems where previously we have never thought that we could do this remotely. You know, every now and again, we've been asked to consider that because obviously the cost of bringing people together is significant to do something like the radar. And so we've never really thought we could do it remotely. Time zone, big issue. We ended up picking sort of a 4 to 6 hour chunk of every day. And we did 4 days in a row. And we asked, actually it was the Australians and our China colleagues who had the worst of it. India didn't have a particularly fun time either. So there were these sort of core hours where some of the folks in the group stayed up and sort of shifted their work day for a week. But I thought it was surprisingly effective. And, you know, in particular, I think there's some things that we did with physical rituals. Like we vote on cards, we vote holding up cards to indicate how we're feeling about particular technology choices. And we digitized a whole bunch of that work. And I thought it worked quite well. Martin, how did you feel about the remote radar that we did?
I felt it went really well. I mean, this is our voting system: red card, yellow card. Worked pretty nicely, all in all. Yeah, I was surprised by how well it went. It was enabled because I was impressed, as I've actually been steadily impressed by Zoom's technology. We've been using Zoom for quite a few years. The way it's held up under the increased demand that's basically turned it into a general purpose verb in the last few months has been pretty impressive. But what also really helped was this fantastic spreadsheet from Nee, who is the sort of technical coordinator of the group. And she used grade A1 spreadsheet programming powers to pull together a really nifty spreadsheet that really made everything work very, very nicely. And I think gives us some good ideas of how we might use some other things. And also triggered the idea of how, when you have got this kind of highly collaborative meeting, it's interesting to see what you can do with these kind of collaboration tools, and remarkable what someone with some imagination can put together with something as basic as a Google spreadsheet. It can really make some interesting differences. And that I thought worked really well. But what we really suffered about was the lack of those little conversations on the side. Because I mean, in a regular radar meeting, I mean, we'll go off for a coffee, or during a break we'll chat a little bit, and of course that never happened. There was no chatting over lunch, no coffee breaks. I mean, we were coffee breaks, but we all went to our own kitchens, and that lost a lot, particularly when it was trying to get some of the context around the blips and trying to pull together some of the themes that would tie things together. Getting to those became really, really difficult remotely.
I'm a little bit of an optimist, and what I really, really liked during this time, I mean, Australia's kind of coming out of it. We're now marching towards, what stage 3 of coming out of this looks like. But I love the challenge that it's kind of set us. Like, it's a forced disruption. Someone has come and, made us, like, shaken us up. It's got the snow globe. They've shaken us up, and we have to work out how to keep carrying on. And things that we would have sworn black and blue was the right way to do it, that we could never do it in any other way, we're forced that we have to. And it's provide us so much opportunity to think about, all right, well, how can I do things differently, and how can I be different, and what can we do to take advantage of the situation that we've got, and what experiments can I run to actually change the way we think. We talked about, in the past, we've thought about that Kaizen model. You have those little system improvements. I love that thinking about them pushing a boulder up the mountain, and then as soon as it starts to go down the mountain, you push it a little bit to center yourself. without that forced disruption, you won't know that the mountain that you're on is actually just a little hill compared to the Mount Everest that's next to you. So I kind of love this like this forced place where we've shaken ourselves up, we've jumped to that next hill, and now we're just trying to work out how to push the boulder up. And where we're going to end up is actually a place that we never expected to be, but it's actually pushing us further and further down that hopefully more successful track.
That is wonderfully positive. And frankly, you know, we're almost at time, and I think that would be a great note to end the webinar on. Very positive, you know, let's shake things up and look at what we can do tomorrow. I would like to thank both of you, Sarah and Martin, for being on the webinar today. We do have a feedback link. So if anyone here has had feedback for us, hit this link and drop us some feedback. And other than that, I don't have a whole lot more to say. I hope folks have found this useful. I've had fun talking about this stuff and presenting here with Sarah and Martin.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.